Good day, this is May I assist you and welcome to English class. Our discussion for this lecture is about the formalism analysis of Joaquin's story, The Order of Melkizedek. There will be four parts of this lecture. First is the summary and the storytelling of the story, and second part includes theme, third will be the formalism analysis, and last is the judgment of the story. Joaquin is well known as a historian of a brief golden age of Spain in the Philippines, as a writer of short stories suffused with folk, Roman Catholicism, as a playwright, and as a novelist. The story of Order of Melkizedek began when Isidro Esteva arrived in Manila with a toothbrush in his carry-on luggage after a decade in San Francisco. The woman in green handed him a card, but a stampede occurred due to the pop star's visit, and he lost the woman in green. He then encountered a girl and a haggard man who asked him for the card and informed Sid that they had mistook him for someone else. But Sid can't locate the card in his pockets, and suddenly a crowd rained down on him again, and Sid misplaced the girl. When Sid got upstairs, he found a crumpled card covered in his handkerchief. It was a timetable with a toothbrush doodle on top. Sid then handed the taxi driver a piece of paper with direction to his sister Adela's house, but the driver took her somewhere off the usual route. He crumpled the paper and slid it down the edge of the sofa, feeling slightly suspicious. Sid was stripped by two men who were anxious to get the card but failed to discover it after the cab parked at the corner. Sid made a hurried getaway and followed the sound of the voices he heard when the two men moved their heads toward the taxi driver. Mrs. Borja and Mang Ambo, the driver, approached naked Sid and offered him assistance. Mrs. Borja gave him her adolescent son's clothes, and they had a brief conversation thereafter. Sid arrived safely home for homecoming. Sid retold the narrative of how he got there from the airport, at the party, under the life-size painting of the founder, the taxi driver, the card, and Mrs. Borja, introducing them to Adela, his old people, Jing Tuanson, and Etoy Banaag. Jing's wife related how he ran across Gia just as she was ready to visit the great fortune teller. Santiago Ferrer suddenly suspected that Gia's gang, as Santiago Ferrer suspected, was not religious but nationalist. On the side, Adela had made arrangement for Gia's wedding, but Sid told her that he wanted to put her in a regular congregation first. When the cops arrived to ask Sid about the cab driver he had recently taken, who had been shot in the back, the celebration was disrupted. Fortunately, Sid and Mrs. Borja were able to reclaim the card. They have both realized that the fortune teller, prophet, and Melkizedek are all the same person. With the card as their only lead, they were able to locate the room 666 at a building in Quiapo. The previous occupants had left the night before, according to the superintendent, and the door used to have a small drawing on a shelf of grain dripping. The day whereupon I ended up going to Intramuros to the nunnery. They knocked on the door, but it was deaf to the world as it has been in the past. They were preparing to leave when they noticed the identical vehicle that had stripped him of his belongings. One girl was among the passengers, one of whom was his sister, Gia. They left without informing the girls that they had been there, and Sid awoke. Gia presented Sister Juana. They discussed the religious movement which aimed to introduce the vitality of traditional worship. Gia explained how she ended up in a group. Sid told her that she had been in shoes before, that being a Steve, Ginny, Gigi, Giyang, and Gia were just stepping stones on the path of her true destiny. Not long after, Sid asked them to bring him to their house. A blaze deep in long grass burned before the shut door in Sister Juana's cells, while flowers and the sheaf of grain were scattered on the ledge. Corpus Christi, their main devotion, is accessible through this entrance. They commemorate it on the feast of the circumcision, which falls on New Year's Eve. Sid Estiba was presented to Father Melchor as they entered the circle of ruins, who wore beetle bangs to disguise an unsightly birthmark on his forehead. Sid arrived at his appointment with Mr. Ferrer and Mrs. Banaag. With the table finally finished, Mrs. Banaag revealed her knowledge of the movement and provided them with contact Dr. Ciriaco Lagman. That night, Sid tried to remember the dream he had the night before he flew out of Manila, in which something happened to him that he hadn't experienced since his teens. They went to Dr. Lagman, who shared his wisdoms about the prophet, the New Jerusalem, when they were exiled and the gold was lost, and his description of the god Balthasar. Then, 2 years before modern day, he was visited by the same man known only as Father Melchor, who hadn't changed a bit in appearance since the last time he saw him. The visitor asked him to help him reconstruct the kingdom, which Dr. Lagman wished to recognize, but he was too feeble, so he declined. Nobody accepted Dr. Lagman's story until Fray Callison came out with information regarding the situation. He had been examining the origins and flow of that religion, and he discovered that the same incident had been occurring in Tibet since 1500s by a man named Gaspar in the 1690s. It is written in the Bible that you are a priest according to the order of Melkizedek. The winter solstice was arrived. Sid and Doña shared a meal. They spent the entire night devouring each other's flesh as a metaphor for assisting the sun god in rising by lighting the bonfire. Sid was informed that Gia was implicated when he arrived at Adelas, and that Mrs. Borja was meant to inform him, but she never did. Santiago recounted the story, claiming that they rescued Father Lau, Gia, and other innocent girls while also apprehending the assailant. With the exception of the prophet, who was a wall, the thugs were all thugs. Later that afternoon, Mr. Lau told Sid and his family his story. When Gia ran into Mr. Lau, he shot the girl twice, each time labeling her evil. Father Melchor delivered Sid his belongings one night and persuaded him that the goods must not be abandoned. Then he went. Sid eventually set fire to those items. Proceeding to the part 2, the theme of the story. The Order of Melkizedek by Joaquin is a story where religion and superstition, the mundane and mystical coverage, and the irrationality of evil being locked up with good is perceivably portrayed. It gives us the moral: no matter what we encounter, no matter where we go or run, no matter what we do or aim, we can never escape our fate. We have to embrace them. We have to embrace the destiny and live for the rest of our life. The lesson for this story: rekindle the feeling of nationalism in the Philippines. As stated in the story, Mrs. Banaag explains the appeal to the cult. She had booked an appointment with Father Melchor at the Quiapo office and was able to meet him. Father Melchor explained that nationalism was not a political but a spiritual problem. Our people had to be renewed in spirit. They were not really political. They had no political ideas. But nationalism as a political movement like Restos would never reach them, but they were deeply religious in a sense that they believed in magical forces, and the nationalist movement could reach them only if it came in the guise of religion, a magical nature religion, but with the Christian forms familiar to them. The tendency to evaluate the past using the present as the absolute standard is a problem we see with our understanding of history. Instead of reverse, we project the current onto the past. The past has become an impediment to the present. Today, we do not consider ourselves product of culture and history. Fiesta is one of the past to present connections. In abandoning the myths about Filipinos and shedding the parochialism and time prism through which we see our history and culture, we may instead achieve something remarkable, recover what it means to be a Filipino, and, in the process, rekindle a feeling of nationalism in the Philippines. To proceed to the analysis of the plot and story, let's focus first to the concept of formalism. Formalism literary theory stresses the analysis of the literary work as a self-sufficient verbal entity constituted by internal relations and independent of reference either to the state of mind of the author or to the external world. According to Abrams, a formalist, the interaction of literary devices create an impression of reality within a text, and therefore it is more important to study these devices rather than the social realities they presented. One of the main ideas in formalism criticism is that poetic language is autotelic. Based on M.H. Abrams, in his book A Glossary of Literary Terms, 1999, autotelic is something that works autonomously and justifies itself without having an external purpose. Formalism literary theory insisted that the everyday language was noticeably different from the literary language. They investigated different literary devices they believed to set the literary language apart from ordinary discourse. The characteristics of formalism literary theory includes formalism criticism is an emphasis on form over the subject matter. The goal of formalism was to create a scientific way of reading and interpreting literature based on linguistic components and literary techniques. Formalism outlined a distinction between literary language and the language of everyday interaction. Similarly, formalists attempted to establish that literature is detached from material history and social context. The formalist believes it was equally or more important to focus on the structural components of the work of literature. The formalist literary theorists place importance on how language operates within the text irrespective of authorship and content. Further, we will look to the plot and story, literariness, the familiarization and foregrounding of the story. Victor Savosky stated the difference between the plot and story. The story or fabula is the natural sequence of events taking place in a text. The plot is the order in which these events are presented in a work. So, the plot of the story in the order of Melkizedek uses foreshadowing, revert, and tragedy. The story of Melkizedek, written by Joaquin, is a story where religion and superstition, the mundane and the mystical are covered, the irrationality of evil being locked up with good is perfectly portrayed. Sid, the main character, learns that, quiet by accident, he's gotten mixed up in a recruitment process for a shadowy, if charismatic, cult calling itself the Order of Melkizedek, whose stated purpose is to put a radically modern but also uniquely native spin on Christian proselytism by infusing it with indigenous imagery and oven festivities in ways still alien and anathema of the Catholic establishment itself is still reeling in the wake of the Second Vatican Council and all its reforms now in the process of implementation. The story was told from an omniscient third-person perspective. It is filled in the facts from the perspective of all the story's character, including their feelings, ideas, and emotions. The story's character have portrayed various viewpoints and opinions in the story's conflict and themes, enhancing the reader's imagination and knowledge. The followings are the names of the story's character. Isidro Estiva. He is the protagonist of the story with the nickname Sid. Adela, Sid's half-sister in father's side, inherited the tobacco business of their father. Gia, Sid's youngest half-sister, inherited the real estate business of their father. Father Melchior or Melkizedek, oldest leader. He leads the cult that exemplifies some of the more outlandish doctrines. Sister Juana, Gia's friend. Santiago Ferrer, Adela's husband. Dr. Lagman, Fray Callison, Mr. Lau, Jing Tuanson and his wife. Etoy Banag and his wife. Moving on to the story's literariness, the formalists saw these techniques and devices as working towards what they called literariness. The formalists used the idea of literariness to differentiate the literary language from the practical use of language, whereas the main function of ordinary languages is for us to communicate with each other. The purpose of literary language is not to make references to the external world. Instead, it draws attention to itself and the linguistic features within itself. By the same token, the formalists believe that the general rules of linguistics did not apply to literary languages. I might say that the story is truly an artistic masterpiece with Joaquin's use of figure of speech. The following figurative language by a word, phrase, or an image has used in the novella. The arc symbol, it serves as an into the theme and foreshadows the story. The order's type of logo, the sacred image, and the sign of the Melkizedek, a sheaf of grain pouring from the trip, is one of the most prudent portrayals of God, since ancient fertility idols were a thing. Subversion. The Second Vatican Council took place in the years 1962 to 1965. The order itself tries to subvert this by adopting very unconventional, non-traditionally Catholic forms of worship, drawing on post-Vatican II reforms, pop culture and music, and indigenous Filipino festivities and imagery. But it is still aiming for Vatican approval according to Gia. Adela, who reveals in passing that her mother was Aglipayan, is another deviation. Example, a member of the Philippine Independent Church, founded by the revolutionary cleric Gregorio Aglipay, basically the local equivalent of the Church of England. The MacGuffin of the story, a toothbrush, is an object or element that drives the plot but has no other use. The toothbrush Sid holds up as a mistaken symbol of identity for the order's recruiters, as well as the card with direction and the sign of the Melkizedek intended for Father Lau, Sid's fellow airplane passengers. After Gia's death and funeral, Sid decides to make a votive gift of the toothbrushes at the Salem House Shrine in Intramuros. the hope spot. At the end of the story, Gia just about freed from the cult's clutches, with her siblings jokingly to get her into what they think is a more well-adjusted, normal life. And even Gia herself makes heard her wishes to strike out of her own again, and then Father Lau shows up at the door and shoots her twice, seeing her as only an evil worse character. In addition, the religious and mythological theme naming gives a high quality of the story. All the reincarnations of Melkizedek, the barring the very first nameless pre-Christian one who invoked pre-colonial gods in his rebellion against the Spanish conquistadores in the late 1500s, are named after the three wise men who visited the newborn Jesus in the manger in the Bible. In order, Gaspar, who led an uprising in the 1680s to return his people to native religion; Baltasar, who proclaimed a new Jerusalem in the province of Pangasinan in the middle of the Philippine-American War, but who in 1900 saw his cult broken up by the American colonial troops, who had several cult leaders imprisoned or hanged; and Melchor, the current version, who sports the normal suit and tie instead of clerical collar during the 16th, and uses imagery and methods drawn both from then current Vatican II and the discovery of indigenous Filipino culture in order to entice modern women into his own following. And lastly, the Twisted Christmas. It's mostly background detail, considering just how central Christmas is to mainstream Catholic Filipino culture, but the whole story takes place around the people or so week surrounding Christmas and New Year of 1966 and 67, and Gia is shot dead in the middle of it. Lastly, Twisted Christmas. It is mostly background detail, but the whole story takes place around the couple or so weeks surrounding Christmas and New Year, and Gia is shot dead in the middle of it. The holidays is still hinted to be ongoing outside during the aftermath when Sid retreats up into his office out of shock. Further, the author skillfully conveys the unpredictable turns of events that leads to the protagonist's fate. Each time he moves forward, the plot twists are intertwined with the plot in every scene, providing readers with foreshadowing. As I have stated earlier, is the plot of the story. The signs and symbols that the protagonist encounters are like Sid Isidro's weave threads that lead him down a path of fate that he cannot reverse. Personally, I prefer reading mystery and thriller stories because they provide readers with questions to solve or allow them to connect with the characters. I suppose a typical college student can read such a long story in one sitting. All in all, the story is engaging and gives entertainment to its readers that I think is also essential in reading the story. Moreover, defamiliarization is one of the key theories of formalism developed by Victor Savosky. Described the concept using the Russian word "ostranenie," which translates as estrangement or making strange. Defamiliarization is the technique of describing something in a strange manner that allows the reader to perceive it in new ways. Defamiliarization helps us pay attention to commonplace things that we fail to notice because they are too familiar to us. The plot slowly reveals the image of each character, not directly described but slowly deploys in the narration. The plot twists were even connected with each other, with the symbols and clues that the protagonist encounters are like threads that was being woven by Sid Isidro. And lastly, foregrounding. The term foregrounding is borrowed from art criticism, where it is used to differentiate the striking aspects of painting or an image from its background. In literature, foregrounding is used to call attention to something or to make something stand out. Foregrounding in literature is to make something so prominent in a narrative that it dominates the reader's perception. Simply put, foregrounding is used to make something hard to miss. Writers use literary devices such as parallelism, alliteration, metaphor, and so on to achieve this effect. For in the story, this figure was mentioned twice or thrice. It is the pregnant virgin. The symbol is a message that says no matter how innocent, unprepared, or amateur you are, your destiny will come at you on time like a pregnant virgin. So, for the last part of our story, formalism analysis, the judgment, the story explores the social reality of human mobility, ideology, and culture, the pre-colonial and pre-Christian persuasions concerning power and ideology brought religion into human history. The order of Melkizedek demonstrates that your own choices determine your own destiny in life. It denotes who you are as a person and what you desire based on your preferences. Furthermore, it emphasizes the character's decision-making in deciding how many entrances and exits to take from the huge array of options available to them. Sid have been through a lot of observations, puzzle solving, and decision making. His good choices prevent him to be engulfed in the flame of the bad future that he might take ahead. The story also demonstrates how a character decision can have an impact on the life of others. Gia had a lovely life but desired to be independent, causing her to do foolish things that clouded her judgment. Gia's siblings sought to save her from the cult she was believing she belongs in, but she ended up on the wrong side. She described it as one crazy thing after another. Gia's siblings wanted to save her from the cult she was thinking she belongs in. Gia's decision was force her to choose between her family and modern Christian religion. Unfortunately, she made the wrong decision and was murdered by Mr. Lau. Choices are mental constructs that allow us to think rationally and erroneously. This, I believe, is why, aside from the theme naming, the title is about order. Our mind tells us to make important life decisions.